Hello again to my barely existing audience of humans, birds, and assorted reptiles. While I have not been around in some time, I did mention that if there was anything of interest to say, I would be back to say it. For this return, I thought it would be good to do another episode of a writer's perspective. I will be focusing on my thoughts on Never Die, a novel by Rob J. Hayes. First, let me provide a bit of an introduction and, as is customary on the channel, an apology for the inevitable failure of the text-to-speech device to pronounce any names properly. Never Die is a novel that is the first book in the Mortal Techniques series, taking place in a fantasy setting that looks to have borrowed a lot of inspiration from China, Mongolia, Japan, and what feels like a bit of Vietnam too. And it also clearly takes a great deal of inspiration from wuxia and anime. As the series name implies, there are warriors in this world who can learn incredible martial techniques that allow them to achieve incredible feats. On display in the novel itself are techniques that allow for line-of-sight teleportation and infusing a sword with magical power so it can cut through anything, including otherwise incorporeal entities. The primary point of view character in what feels more like a strong ensemble cast is the Whispering Blade, Itami Cho, who dies by the end of the first chapter. Also, her death is pretty much outright said to happen in the prologue. She is revived by an unnerving child named Ein, who sets upon her a task that he must perform and she must assist with. However, even with her skills, she cannot do it alone and he inevitably recruits other heroes to join her. Though they need to be dead first, so he can bring them back to life and bind them to him. To ensure loyalty and, to a limited extent, obedience. One of the first things I will say are part of the book's strengths is the easy flow of the writing, particularly in fight scenes. Since fighting and killing are a pretty important part of the story and I sense there was a subtle need to show off the various possibilities in terms of techniques, this is hugely important. And Never Die does not disappoint in terms of readability. The action flows from one movement to the next, and I never felt lost even in the more hectic fights that occur near the end. Though I do feel that the individual ways the characters fight isn't as distinct as they could have been. I never got a particular sense of weight from Iron Gut Chen's heavy mace or what set apart Whispering Blade's swordsmanship from Emerald Wind's, apart from the latter using hooked swords to grab things. I also didn't get a feel for the supposedly incredible unharmed fighting skills of Bing Gui Ma despite being told repeatedly about them. The plot of Never Die is fairly basic, and sort of feels like it was taken right out of an early example of a JRPG. It can often feel more like an excuse to justify all the fighting that the characters end up doing, giving them each a chance to make use of their specific skills. But at the same time, people who read for the plot will find it lacking and weak. Though I should point out there is one particular twist near the end that actually does justify the way events played out. It also gives the book a bit of reread value, since once you know the twist, it can be great fun going over the story again to see all the times it was foreshadowed. And that is one of the greater strengths of Never Die. It has a surprise twist, but it does not rely on it to be entertaining or readable. I do need to point out that, in terms of character work and world building, Never Die is rather weak. While each of the major characters is given enough to make them distinct, they are also almost entirely flat characters. They do have some minor arcs, but there is very little in the way of them feeling like they have grown or developed. Though the interpersonal relationships between the characters does develop more strongly, particularly between Iron Gut Chen and Emerald Wind, as well as Emerald Wind and Whispering Blade. Being late to the game, Death's Echo and Bing Gui Ma don't quite develop as much as the others, so consequently feel a little disconnected from the others. World building, as noted, is a little weak too. We get tidbits of useful information, though it can feel a little shallow, especially compared to the more in-depth coverage we get in things like Malazan or The Lord of the Rings. It relies heavily on front-loading the picture on the reader, counting on them to have a vague idea of what fantasy China might look like. This is not a bad thing, and having the reader do as much of the heavy lifting as possible is part and parcel of my own writing strategy, but Never Die doesn't quite give enough concrete visual detail to enable that heavy lifting. Overall, Never Die is an enjoyable read and I enjoyed it for the prose and the fights more than anything else. There is a virtue to be found in flowing and readable prose, and the fights have a sense of energy to them that makes for a dynamic, engaging read. It is flawed and far from a masterpiece, but if you are looking for something to act as a palate cleanser between longer series or just want to give something new a try, you can definitely do worse than this novel. And I should point out that the author does improve in later installments in the series. The second book, Pawn's Gambit, has much stronger character work and a bit more world building without sacrificing the flow and readability of the prose. The third book, Spirits of Vengeance, has the strongest sense of characterization of the lot, along with more of the world fleshed out for the reader. Incidentally, the Mortal Techniques is set up like my Rax books. Same world, but the stories are largely independent of each other, making it feel more like a shared universe than a traditional series. In the end, Never Die is not something I would recommend to anyone. In fact, I don't think I've ever recommended it to anyone so far. However, it is still a great popcorn action flick in written form, and it's a good choice if you are after something along those lines and don't want to invest too much time in another long series. With that, this episode of A Writer's Perspective comes to an end. If you liked this or just want to support the nonsense I write, there will be links to my books and my Patreon below. Until next time, mind the lizard.